Warning! Kinda Murdery contains adult themes, explicit language, and descriptions of violence. It is not suitable for anyone, and we recommend you stop listening now.
True crime with a dash of the paranormal, the garish, the strange, and the darkly comic. I'm Zevon Odelberg, host of Kinda Murdery, a podcast that's about more than just murder. It's my very own pocket dimension, home to a curated collection of bizarre and compelling stories. The unsolved, the unsettling, and the unbelievable. I cover it all, just so long as it's kinda murdery. My sincere thanks again to Kelsey Childs and Pamela J. from Haunted Detective for filling in last week. Please do check out Haunted Detective wherever you get your podcasts and subscribe. It's a great show. The ladies from Haunted Detective were kind enough to fill in for me while I was recovering from throwing out my back, but my back is better and I am back, and I am Zevon Odelberg, and this is Kinda Murdery. I found the story you're about to hear in the January 1929 issue of True Detective magazine. My sources are in the show notes, and boy, this is a humdinger of a whodunit, folks. It's a heck of a story, a really happened. First-person, true crime-noir detective story as told by the Burlington County, New Jersey Chief of Detectives, Ellis H. Parker. I gotta tell you, Ellis H. Parker sure sounds like the name of a Bogart private eye if I've ever heard one. And this, what you're about to hear, is Detective Parker's story as told to Alan Hind, formerly of the Boston Post. Here's the hook. When 47-year-old wealthy showman and circus owner John Brunen was murdered in his own home, shotgunned in the back of the head before he even had a chance to draw the pistol he always carried, I'm talking had his head blown off from behind in his own home, while his wife, Doris, a former Broadway chorus girl, was upstairs. When that happened, famous New Jersey sleuth Ellis Parker swore to get the murderer. But Parker never guessed that he would check up on 600 possible suspects without finding a single clue. He'd hit a stone wall. Where would he turn next? Well, if you're ready to find out, please join me as we uncover what truths we can and solve what mysteries we may. Kinda Murderies, the disappearing parrot. That's right, like, Polly want a cracker? The disappearing parrot starts now. Between 7:45 and 8 o'clock on the evening of March 10th, 1922, the telephone in my office rang. I was lying down at the time, having lost 2 nights' rest while working on an important case, and I did not much relish the idea of getting up to answer a call. However, something told me the call was for me and that it might be official business. Call it an instinct, call it gut, whatever you like. But during the few seconds that elapsed between the time that the idea first occurred to me and the time that my secretary, Miss Anna Use, answered the phone, I became thoroughly convinced that something was in the wind. I was right. "Is that you, Parker?" were the words that greeted me when I answered. Miss Hughes having told me that the call was personal and important one. The voice on the other end of the wire was a Chief Voschel. That's Chief of Police William Voschel of Riverside, New Jersey, just a few miles from Mount Holly, the county seat of Burlington County, where I made my home for the last 35 years. I replied to Voschel in the affirmative and was greeted with, "That circus guy. You know, Honest John Brunen. Somebody killed him in his own home." "Where are you, Chief?" I queried. "I'm at the Brunen home." "I'll be there as quick as possible," I said. "Don't let anyone touch anything." A queer feeling passed through me. No wonder, for I was a warm friend of John Brunen. I'd known him for years. Hell, we'd been talking only a few days before. We was discussing his carnival, the Mighty Doris shows, which I was going to take to the road shortly. Miss Hughes and another one of my assistants, Clifford Kane, donned their coats for the automobile trip to Riverside, and just as we were getting in the car, along comes State Trooper Herman Bating, who'd been doing some work in connection with my office. So Herman joins us and we're off within 2 minutes of the phone call. Little did we realize that we were about to work on what proved to be one of the most brutal, as well as one of the most complex and baffling crimes that's ever come to my attention in the 35 years that I've been tracking down, well, criminals. As we drove along the quiet road to Riverside, I couldn't help but think of what some might call the irony of fate. You see, John Brunen had often asked me how I went about the thrilling business of solving murder and mysteries. In spite of the fact that I hadn't even reached the scene of the crime, I instinctively began speculating on possible motives. Had Honest John been killed by some disgruntled, discharged employee? I couldn't recall Brunen ever having told me that anyone was out to, get him. But, he was wealthy and he was known in Riverside as a, quote, big theatrical man, unquote. I wondered, therefore, if robbery could have been behind the killing, but these speculations were neither here nor there, so I stopped quizzing myself. As we drew up to the Brunen home, I was immediately impressed by the fact that it was an excellent spot for a killer to, kill. The night was pitch black and there were no lights nearby. To the right of the Brunen home, which was a huge, old-fashioned frame dwelling, stretched fields. Fields big enough to give a dozen secret slayers room to make clean getaways. In the rear of the house was a garage. Beyond that, nothing for quite some distance. To the left of the place, quite a bit of ground separated it from the next dwelling. Ringing the front doorbell, I was admitted to the house by Mrs. Brunen. She'd been widowed for less than an hour. Her eyes were swollen from crying, and she was in a state bordering on extreme hysteria. Chief of Police Voschel, upon seeing me, told me where the body was and led me to the kitchen. There, I found the man I'd talked with only several days before. He was slumped in a chair. Half his head had been blown off by the charge from a shotgun. The floor was literally covered with blood and brains. On the floor near the body was a newspaper which the murdered man had been reading. I found out later that he'd been reading about a murder case in California. What a strange coincidence, huh? Brunen had been sitting in a chair close to and with his back toward the one window in the kitchen, which, of course, was in the extreme rear of the house. There was a hole in the pane about 4 inches in diameter. Looking more closely, I found that the glass had been blown inward. This was a clear and positive indication that the murderer had fired the death shot as he stood outside the house. Going round the back of the house, I succeeded in finding, with the aid of a flashlight, the footprints I expected. There were 2 sets of them, those of a man and those of a woman. Mrs. Brunen told me later that she'd made the woman's prints when she went out to put her bulldog in the cellar for the night. The other footprints were those of a man, of presumably short and slight stature. I arrived at this conclusion because the size of the prints were quite small, and the impression made on the soft ground was not very heavy. I followed the footprints as best I could under the difficulty presented by the extreme darkness, and they led to a lane, where I found fresh automobile tracks. The fact that the shotgun had been used convinced me beyond doubt that the crime was not the work of a hired or experienced gunman. In the first place, a hired gunman wouldn't risk being detected carrying anything so bulky. Second place, a hired killer usually, quote, works, unquote, with a revolver, because in almost every case, he's clever enough to get his man with the first shot. A shotgun is, as a rule, used by someone who's not sure of his aim and who therefore believes that the bigger the weapon, the bigger his chance of hitting his target in the first place. Additionally, the fact that the slayer stood right up against the window to fire the shot, as revealed by the footprints, proved to me that he was more or less of an amateur who wanted to make doubly sure that he got Brunen on the first shot. The comparatively small hole in the window pane was additional proof that the shot had been fired at close range, that the shotgun pellets hadn't had time to spread out before they hit the window. I decided that to make any further attempt to trace material clues around the grounds was impossible then on account of the dark night. So, I instructed my associates to keep a close guard around the grounds all night. I then went back to the kitchen. Here, I might pause for a moment to explain to you that the eye of a man trained in detecting crime will instinctively notice things which are overlooked by the average Joe. The peculiar arrangement of a bit of furniture, a stopped clock, a disarranged curtain. Any one of those things may be the very thing to furnish the solution to the most baffling crime, and yet they seem so unimportant on the surface to most people. Bearing this in mind, as I always do, I was immediately impressed by the fact that a parrot, which had been in a cage hanging in the kitchen, was missing. Not just the bird, but his cage too. You see, Brunen was a friend. I'd been in that room on more than one occasion before, and I'd unconsciously taken a mental photograph of everything in it. The parrot, which, by the way, was a talking one, had been there for years. That night, it was missing. Looking around the house without saying what I was looking for, I soon discovered the parrot in the cellarway. A cloth had been thrown over the cage. I kept this observation to myself as I I have found that a detective invariably makes a blunder whenever he reveals his hand, except when forced to do so. The incident of the parrot being removed might mean very little, and I won't go as far as to say it was of paramount importance to me just then, but it was something to be taken into consideration. It gave me an inkling that the murder might just be an inside job. I then asked Mrs. Brunen for a statement. She said that her husband had arrived home at 6 o'clock or thereabouts, and that he'd driven to Williamstown, Jersey early that morning in Hortense. The family car, that's what they called the family car. Hortense. Don't ask me. She said he had to attend to several business matters at the winter quarters of his show. When he arrived home that night, he put the car in the garage as usual, then into the house. He said he was tired and hungry, but he thought he would wash up and put on fresh clothes before eating dinner. When he was done fixing himself up a bit, Brunen came downstairs feeling in good spirits. He joked with his wife. "Say, Dot," he said, "I'm not such a bad-looking guy when I'm cleaned up, am I?" Then John and his wife were alone in the house. For a while, he ate a hearty dinner. Mrs. Brunen then washed the dishes, while John sat with her in the kitchen with his back to the window and began reading the news of the day, his usual custom. One of the first things that caught his attention was a California murder case wherein a woman had been accused of brutally slaying her husband. "Do you know, Dot," said Brunen to his wife, "I don't believe that woman knows a thing about that killing." It was then about 7:30 p.m., and Mrs. Brunen said she went outside to put the dog in the cellar. Coming back inside, she went upstairs to draw her husband a hot bath. The shade above his head pulled down halfway, as was customary. A light directly above his head outlined the killer's target very clearly. There's a railroad near the Brunen home, and 2 trains were scheduled to pass at about 7:30. That's when the shot was fired, and Mrs. Brunen was the only one who heard the gun report. The noise of one of the trains drowned it out. It was apparently perfectly timed. Mrs. Brunen said that she ran down to the kitchen when she heard the shot, but stopped at the threshold when she saw the ghastly sight of her husband with his melon blown off. She notified a woman neighbor about 10 minutes later. When I asked her why she'd allowed such a length of time to elapse before giving any alarm, she replied that she'd been so upset she didn't know what she was doing, which seemed reasonable under the circumstances. During my questioning of Mrs. Brunen, I found that she and her husband had often quarreled. She assured me, however, that there'd never been any serious differences between them. Mrs. Brunen, at the time of the murder, was an attractive blonde woman of 36, rather plump. She'd been married once before she became John's wife. John Brunen, a German guy middle-aged, had also been married once before he wed the current Mrs. Brunen. He had a daughter, Hazel, a good-looking kid of 17 by his first wife. I found out later that the Brunens had quarreled seriously at a time when Hazel ran off with a circus lion tamer, and that shots had been fired by both Mrs. Brunen and her husband. A bullet from Brunen's gun struck Mrs. Brunen, but the injury was not serious. A corset steel caused the bullet to glance off. I also learned through questioning the widow that her husband, years before, had been tried for murdering another man. He was acquitted on grounds of self-defense. By this time, the plot was, as they say in the movies, thickening. Mrs. Brunen was getting more and more nervous every minute, and the process of drawing information from her was growing more difficult. I was afraid that she was going to faint on several occasions, but I had to try to get as much as possible, for I had no time to lose. So I asked Mrs. Brunen if she had any idea who killed her husband. She thought for a moment, and then replied that she suspected a man named George Werner, a circus chef known as Dutchy. This Werner, she said, had been discharged by Brunen not long before the murder, and he'd threatened to, quote, get, unquote, his employer. We all know what that means, right? So I asked the widow to describe Dutchy, and she said he was a short man. I then asked if he was heavy or slight in build. She said he didn't weigh very much. I noticed at once that this description fitted in fairly well with the picture of the slayer, which I'd conjured up with the aid of the footprints. I asked Mrs. Brunen when she'd seen Dutchy last, and she replied that it had been a matter of weeks. She added that she hadn't the slightest idea as to his present haunts. It was now pretty well along toward midnight when the doorbell rang, and in walks Harry C. Moore, Mrs. Brunen's brother. Now, Moore's a tall, heavy-set fella in his mid-30s. He'd been a showman himself for a little over a year, and he'd been associated with Brunen's show. Prior to that, he'd had a show of his own on the road. Moore, who lived with the Brunens, explained that he'd driven up from Philadelphia. He seemed apparently greatly upset about the murder, and he asked me if I'd picked up any clues. I told him about the footprints. He went out, took a look at them, swore, something I can't repeat, and then he called me to one side. Parker," he says. "There'll be a big reward in this for you if you can track down the fiend who did this job." Guy had one hell of a voice. So I then asked Moore if Brunen had any enemies who would be likely to murder him for a grudge. Moore reflected for a moment and then mentioned the name of the same man as Mrs. Brunen, the discharged chef, Werner. I asked Moore to describe Werner, and his description tallied exactly with that of Mrs. Brunen. I asked Moore if he thought the footprints in the rear of the house might be those of Werner. He said it looked that way to him, adding that Werner had been overheard on more than one occasion to say that he would get even with John Brunen for discharging him. Furthermore, he stated that Werner was the type of guy who would seek vengeance, and that, on occasion, Werner, following an argument with Brunen, chased the latter from the lunch car at the point of a gun. I told Moore and Mrs. Brunen that I would bend every effort to catch up with Werner at the earliest possible moment, and I asked them to assist me in any way possible to find out the whereabouts of this fired chef. Mrs. Brunen was then emotionally overcome, and she offered me her diamonds if I apprehended the slayer. From Mrs. Brunen and her brother, I learned that several employees of the mighty Doris shows were living in the cities of Perth, Amboy, Paterson, and Jersey City, New Jersey. I at once called the police departments of those cities from the Brunen home and asked that all employees of the Brunen show be questioned immediately and made the given account of their actions at the time of the murder. I always followed the plan of checking up on anyone who could possibly have even the slightest connection with a crime. And then I go to the process of elimination. In this way, I lay a groundwork that cannot be shaken because all possible angles are covered, and the process of closing in on the guilty party is not so hard as it may seem. So when I drove home in the early hours, I congratulated myself. Not such a bad night. I knew that I was on the killer's trail. In fact, I was positive, and you'll find out why later. The next day, newspaper headlines said a manhunt was on for Dutchy Werner. Bright and early in the morning, refreshed by 3 hours sleep, I resumed my investigation of the grounds surrounding the Brunen home. My men, who'd kept guard all night, had prevented anyone from loitering around the place, as I wanted to keep the footprints and any other clues intact. With Chief of Police Voschel, I went once again to the spot where the killer had fired through the window. Then we carefully followed the footprints to the lane where the murderer had escaped by an automobile, and this is where Chief Voschel picked up what proved later to be the most important clue in the solution of the mystery. "Look here, Mr. Parker," he shouted. Chief Voschel had run across part of a grip of the slayer's shotgun. It'd been dropped during the flight. On the grip was a number which corresponded to the number on the missing barrel and stock. I knew that if we could only locate the gun itself, we'd be able to identify it immediately, owing to the piece being broken off the grip. But more on that later too. About the remaining part of the gun, I mean. At this point, I called my assistants Clifford Kane and Herman Bating, and I had them witness the finding of the grip, etc., etc. I always make a point of having other people witness things as I go along in a murder case. It's a good idea, no, scratch that, it's a great idea for a detective to have as many people back up his story as possible. One man should never monopolize the witness stand. It was then that I questioned those living in the vicinity of the Brunen home. Nobody'd heard a shot fired, but some neighbors had seen a man about Werner's size run across the fields from the Brunen home, jump into a Ford coupe that had been parked in the lane, and speed off with the lights out in the direction of Camden. Yet the people who saw this told me they didn't attach any particular significance to it at the time. What the actual fuck? The man they saw running across the fields carrying something which they thought looked like an umbrella instead of a shotgun. I guess that's their excuse. You know, it's strange how people arrive at surface conclusions and then build up false theories accordingly. This is a failing of human nature, which, and this may shock you, I have observed on countless occasions. The trouble with some people is, of course, that they don't stop to think. When a man dashes across the fields and then speeds away in an automobile with the lights out, some people don't stop to think that maybe, yeah, just maybe that might mean that something unusual is in progress. Well, anyway, in a short time I located Dutchy Werner in Berwyn, Pennsylvania, and I went there to question him. Dutchy eyed me up and down suspiciously when I told him who I was, and he asked me in broken English what he could do for me. I gave it to him straight that I was investigating the murder of John Brunen and thought perhaps he could shed some light on it. Dutchy immediately denied he knew anything at all, and then I told him that Harry Moore had implicated him. When cornered, a guilty man will usually shift the responsibility. Again and again, I have found this to be one of the most positive evidences of guilt. Dutchy, on the other hand, did nothing of the kind. He confined himself to a very strong denial that he had anything to do with Brunen's death, And when I checked up on Dutchie's story as to his whereabouts at the time of the crime, I was soon convinced that he was not the man. Dutchie was not the guy I wanted. Arriving back in Burlington County, I began casting about for another man of Werner's type, in spite of the fact that Moore could not be convinced that Dutchie was not the individual who did the killing. By this time, we were going after the case from several angles. For one thing, we hunted high and low for someone who saw the deathmobile with the lights off as it sped away from the murder. Finally, a man named Arthur Fletcher, a Philadelphian, came to us and he said that he was positive that he'd seen the Ford Coupe of the Slayer as it made its way into the direction of Camden. Fletcher was driving past the Brunen residence on his way home around 7:30 on the night of the crime, when he saw the Ford Coupe turn out of a lane and head in a southerly direction, with its lights out. Fletcher thought this was suspicious and endeavored to follow the car. He didn't succeed in keeping pace with it, but he did get a license number by the aid of the headlights on his own machine. He wrote the number down on a piece of paper, but his fortune, or in this case misfortune, would have it, Fletcher's wife mislaid the paper the next day, little realizing she was destroying the few numerals which in their proper sequence could probably have saved untold time, labor, and expense in the solution of this case. As for Fletcher, for the life of him he couldn't remember the license number. Just another one of the many tough breaks to expect in a detective's profession. So now I had a whole lot of people working on the case. The probable route of the death car from the Brunen home toward Camden was carefully combed, and within a week, Chief of Police Morris Beck of Palmyra, New Jersey, located a shotgun barrel in Pennsauken Creek on the road between Burlington and Camden. The shotgun barrel was in the mud on the edge of the creek, not far from the main highway. It had apparently been tossed in there at high tide, but at low tide, it was visible. Checking up, we found that the number on the barrel corresponded to the number on the portion of the grip found on the ground surrounding the Brunen home. And if you want to find out what happens next for Detective Ellis Parker in the case of the disappearing parrot, then please do join me next Thursday, May 2nd, for part 2. But before I let you go, don't go, because we've got some stuff to talk about. That's right, it's time for 3 key takeaways and a moral. Is there in fact any generally applicable wisdom that can be gleaned from the story so far? Well, you tell me. Here we go. Here are the 3 key takeaways. Number 1, echoes of the past. Personal histories often cloud the present, steering the course of events in unexpected ways. For example, George Werner, who was previously fired by Brunen, became a prime suspect based on past grievances rather than current evidence, and Parker, to his credit, was able to dismiss Werner pretty quickly. Sometimes we're too quick to judge people by bad stuff that might have happened to them before rather than what they're doing now. I'd say that's generally true. Takeaway number 2, hidden motives. The smallest details can hold the key to unraveling complex mysteries, suggesting deeper, unseen forces at play. Well, example, the removal of the parrot from the kitchen to the cellar, although it's hard to fathom exactly what that has to do with the murder, it does hint at manipulation of the crime scene in a way that suggests the crime may have been committed by someone familiar with their surroundings. Number 3, the fragility of human bonds. Now, family and business entanglements reveal the delicate balance of trust and suspicion that often defines, unfortunately, fortunately, who knows, but often defines human relationships. Example, the Brunens had a history of serious quarrels and previous altercations, underscoring the volatile nature of their relationship, something which may very well influence the investigation's direction going forward. But if you want to find out, you'll have to come back on Thursday, May 2nd for part 2, and now on to the moral of the story so far. And here it is. Since after all, our victim did own a circus, the moral of the story so far is, even in a circus ring where illusions entertain, the greatest illusions often occur unseen, behind the scenes, and what you see is only misdirection. Sometimes what's not there is even more important than what is. Again, please join me next week for part 2 of Kinda Murdery's The Disappearing Parrot. Until then, thank you so much for being here. I'm Zevon Odelberg, and this has been Kinda Murdery.
If you like the show, please subscribe, review, and tell your friends. You can find us on social media at Kinda Murdery or email at kindamurdery@gmail.com.